ونصلي على رسول الكريم أما بعد. Okay, so we're continuing with our discussion about the attributes in Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi's al-iqtisad fi al-i'tiqad. We were discussing sifat of qudra, which is Allah's power. We determined and we found that if we take Allah's attribute of power seriously, then it would imply, based on this metaphysics and theology, that Allah is the one that creates all things, including all of our actions. And this idea and concept is in the Quran as well, where it says things like خالق كل شيء, Allah created everything. And وما رميت إذ رميت ولكن الله رماه, when you threw, you did not throw, it was Allah that threw, although that's might be considered poetic, but it's evidence nonetheless. And then of course وما تشاءون إلا أن يشاء الله رب العالمين. It says this twice, وما تشاءون إلا يشاء Allah, you do not will or make any intention except that it is Allah, occurs through Allah's will, or it is Allah's will. And there was one part that I discussed last time that might have seemed quite confusing. So he gave the example of a key, which is a condition for opening the door, even though the key itself, it doesn't create an action for opening the door, but it is a logical condition for the door to be open. A similar argument might be that how is it that a person can fit through a door? Or is it because Allah creates the action of fitting through the door, or is it just a logical condition where something must be bound, where something must be able to reduce itself or to a size smaller than a door, or be smaller than a door to go through that specific size door? And this is really just you could just say a logical condition which follows the laws of logic. The laws of logic aren't necessarily something which God must abide by. Rather, these are conventions and observations we find when we consider language, where we find that one premise, with the conclusion of a certain set of premises, lead to impossibilities. And when we say impossibilities, we mean basically that the conclusion just doesn't make sense. There's no meaning that's given to the listener or the reader when they read that statement. So when a statement is read that this circle was a square, that's a contradiction, because no meaning is given. Because when we think of things, we think of ideas, we think normally with images or ideas, and when we or definitions even. And when the word square is said, we have a certain image of a four-sided shape, and then we say that the square is a circle, and then we have another shape which is just one. You could say one-sided, I guess, for a circle, and that's clearly not the same thing as a square. So it's the same in the same way. If I was to say something that could not fit through the door, that is a logical contradiction. So these are logical conditions, and which are part of this meaningful and ordered creation that Allah has brought about. And once again, they aren't things which are forcing Allah to behave in a certain way. These are just things which are just meaning. This is just meaning consequences of language. I also wanted to discuss, before moving on to the next attribute, was some other perspectives. This is because we discussed last time that Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi, his view, or the view that the Asha'ira hold to, and most of Islam really is, people don't like using the term, is occasionalism, where it implies that every occasion is just an opportunity for Allah to create. And some Western scholars and thinkers have come up with similar conclusions. So there's in the West someone known as Marie Blanc. He was famous for this. He was a French philosopher, and this information I got from this lecture by Jim Sanchez. I haven't personally read all of Marie Blanc's works because I'm not too interested, because it's more about Christian theology. But I am interested in how he arrived at occasionalism. So he said he was more concerned with consciousness. And the mind-body problem. How do we find a way to correlate and give a reasonable explanation of how the mind and body interact with one another? And that's how he came upon the idea of occasionalism in the West. Whereas Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi's occasionalism came simply because of reflection upon Allah's attribute of power. There wasn't any motivation of how to reconcile some kind of thought. Rather, it was just a lot then conclusion he came upon, or not just him, but the Ash'ari came upon after reading the Quran and Sunnah and considering the universe using a rational uh, lens. So he says sensations are in our mind and they are extensions, and they do not tell us the essence of a thing. So sensations themselves, these are things that we feel in the mind, and they are extensions, and they do not tell us the essence of a thing. But we know of these things through illumination from God, in whose mind the ideas reside. So he has this kind of divine conceptualism. So it was quite common for Christian thinkers in the medieval time to hold to divine conceptualism. It's where the Platonic realms, or these ideas, they exist in the mind of God. Platonism generally, it's this philosophy where there is the perfect form of the ideas, which we could see incomplete imitations in this realm. For example, if there's a chair, then this is an incomplete imitation of what it means to be the perfect chair, the essence of a chair, which exists in this perfect realm. And so they are independent ideas. But in theism, you can't have this notion where these independent forms exist, non-spatial independent forms exist outside of God, and there's numerous problems because of it, because it would imply that God depends on these ideas themselves in order for him to instantiate his attributes. Therefore, and there's a few, I don't want to go into that right now, but because of this is a motivation to hold to divine conceptualism, where these Platonic realms in fact depend on God rather than being completely independent, and they depend on him by existing in his mind, in his knowledge, possibly in his knowledge in some way. So these sensations which we experience in our minds, we know of them because we have a direct relationship with God according to this Christian theology, which Marie Blancs was working. And so in this divine conceptualism, he believed that all of these ideas existed in God's minds, and we don't have these ideas ourselves. However, we have a direct relationship with God, and we feel these sensations in our minds through some kind of illumination. So this is also because we are finite, and ideas themselves are infinite. So like I said, this comes from Platonism, where the ideas themselves are infinite and perfect. And in this divine conceptualism, where they exist in the mind of God, who is also perfect and infinite, they must also be infinite. Therefore, these ideas cannot exist within our finite minds. So we can only experience them through some limited form of illumination on behalf of God. So they can only exist in the infinite mind. They can't exist truly in our mind. We only have illuminations. There is a unity with God in the sense where we have a perpetual relation to the divine mind through illumination, where we can see some of the ideas. The mind only has views of particulars. The idea is general, like the idea of a square, but becomes particular when the mind perceives it. So we have these infinite these forms that exist in the mind of God, and they are general, but they become particular because when the mind perceives it, it relates it to something which we observe through our senses, and it particularizes it. So like we see a particular square, like a square house, so the ideas are accompanied by a sensory perception in the mind. So we have a sensory perception through our vision or sight, and this in our mind, like a square house, and this illumination from God about the general idea of a square illuminates us, and then we are able to conceptualize what it means to be a square house. So he agrees, and this is a particular type of square because it's a square house. We can't see square, the essence of square. He agrees with Leibniz in the plurality of substances, but agrees with Spinoza in that there's only one cause. Creations are just occasions for God's acts, and this is his version of occasionalism. So when he says occasionalism, what he's saying is everything is just a causal effect, and there's only one true and immediate cause. Like when you get hurt, like by a cut, this is really an occasion. It's an opportunity, an occasion for God to create a sense of mental pain in the mind. The cut doesn't really cause the pain, and that's not too far from what we consider today, because we can have people that don't experience pain, but they have injuries, and this, I guess you could say, some people consider as to be a mental illness. Anyways, volition and mental thoughts, like our intention, our mental thoughts, they are also occasions for God to cause something to happen in the external world, and also for the mind to perceive itself as a cause. So it's quite interesting. So he says first that what's the relationship between the mind and the physical world? So he says the external world might be means of Something might happen in the external world, and this will be an occasion for God to create a relationship with the external world, with your mind. And sometimes things might happen in your mind, which will also be an occasion for God to create something to happen in the external world. So we have the intention in our mind. We have these intention and will. We have the intention and will, these volitional and mental thoughts, and that is an occasion, because we have these mental volitional thoughts. It's an occasion for God to cause something through our actions in the external world. So it's God that is doing all of this, and also for the mind to perceive itself as the cause. So because we have these, God creates these volitional and mental thoughts in our mind. God makes makes the mind assume or perceive that it itself is the cause. So it's interesting. They used, so this, or one thing I should note, and I've already discussed this. So here, this is quite emphasized in their works during that period of time and thinking, that occasionalism was used kind of ad hoc upon the Christian tradition to solve this mind-body problem that arose from Cartesian dualism and God's relation to the world. So Cartesian dualism is just reference to Descartes' view on the mind and body. So he would say that the mind is of a different essence or substance, and the body also are different substance and essence, and they exist separately. But there is a relation, but they do relate. They could relate with one another. And I keep forgetting his name. Marie Blanc was heavily influenced by Descartes and his Cartesian dualism, and that's why he framed his occasionalism around this. So he also critiques that there's no necessary connection between physical or mental events, even though a cause is supposed to be having a necessary causal effect. So even though a cause is supposed to be A having a necessary causal effect on B, so a cause, according to him, doesn't have a necessary relationship with its effect. Rather, it's God's omnipotency shows that there is a necessary relationship between occasions where God wills for something to happen, where it must happen, or else he will not be omnipotent. So in order to maintain God's omnipotence, he puts forward this occasionalism, where the cause and effect that we observe are really just occasions for God to express his omnipotence. So also, based on Cartesian dualism, the body is pure extension. So it's just the three dimensions: the height, width, and the length, width, and height. Sorry, and it by itself has no causal power. So although we might be able to will a body part to move when doing voluntary acts, we do not perceive any relationship between the willing of ourselves and the external action. So when we do something like an action, move a hand, etc., we do not perceive the actual relationship between the willing. And this is Hume also adopts this kind of thought and thinking. And he has his theodicy. Obviously, there's a theodicy here as well. And this theodicy just means the idea of evil. So he says God creates the soul with the nature for good, but because of original sin, this placed an unbalance on reason, and man has the free will to suspend. Because of this, man now has the free will to suspend God's causal power. So the soul is still caused by God to tend towards good, but due to free will, this cause is temporarily suspended. It's very strange and ajib. And Imam Razi actually mentions this in his Matalib al-Aliya when he discusses the 12 categories that he believes that one must fall under when we consider the nature of God as a willing agent or necessitarian cause. He also believes that God doesn't perform particular acts whenever a new event occurs. Rather, he has a general act where he has ordained that whenever certain things happen, they will lead to a specific outcome generally. So he doesn't need to newly act each time. So I guess this is to preserve God being eternal and not changing. So classical theism trying to preserve that. So rather, within God there is a generality of means of production. So it's somewhat like the will. If we were to act whenever, due to the natural course of things, some evil were to occur. So whenever, imagine when an evil thing was to happen and God was to act to prevent this every time this occurred. So like it might have been that a disabled child was to be born and God was to act whenever that happened to prevent it, then he would need to always perform miracles. So he is defining miracles as God's direct intervention now, which is outside of his habitual acts, which are the result of his general act. or commands. He instead has a general volition. God has a general volition according to his theology, that whenever such and such an occasion occurs, then such and such a result will also follow. So he acts simply and not through complexity. So Descartes' Cartesian dualism is that mind and body are different substances, but it just really shows that from an epistemic view, you can't really know whether they are different or not. It's just a possibility. So we just a bit more introduction to Descartes' Cartesian dualism, since I think there's something within there that framing which can also um, support Ghazali or the Ash'ari view on their occasion. So this Descartes' Cartesian dualism is that mind and body are different substances. They aren't even just different things which are of the same substance. They're completely different substances. But really from his argumentation, what we to prove that they're different substances, all it really shows is that from an epistemic view, like how we learn things, you can't really know whether they are different or not. It's just a possibility. There's also the problem of how a mental thing could interact with a physical thing, and that was Monte Blanc. As we just discussed, he used this sort of occasionalism to bridge that problem. So this is especially a problem for Descartes, because he believed that causes are as real as their effects in terms of change. Ironically, though, even though Hume was a critic of Descartes, his view of causation, simply being habits we observe, somehow helps the dualism issue, since the causes are just events that follow one another, and we don't really know if they have a certain correlation with the events. Effects, e.g., the first man would be as confused as us when it comes to quantum physics, when he observed causes and effects that we assume to be habitual today. So if you assume imaginary first person and he just came to this universe and then he saw a cause an effect which we take for granted, then for him that would appear as strange. That relationship between that cause and effect would appear as strange as the nature of quantum physics when we observe these things. So there's also something known as a causal closure principle, where physical things can only affect other physical things, which is quite a contemporary idea. So how could mental things affect the physical? But you could also say that how would you ever be able to know if a mental concept affects physical atoms, since you can't see the former? So it's just begging the question, really, because how do you know that a mental thing can't affect physical things? It's just an assumption, this causal closure principle. But all of this still sort of supports the Ghazalian occasionalism from Hume skepticism, where effects are just habits that are created one after the other, and the mental doesn't really cause the physical, as per the physical closure principle. So I thought I'd bring this to here because the Cartesian dualism introduces this mind and body problem, and Hume shows that the causes aren't really related to one another, and we can't say that these the cause and effect which we habitually call do really have some intrinsic relationship with one another. And this is what we are seeing as well from the occasionalism view of Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi, where these are just habits, and the divine habits which Allah creates. And as for the causal closure principle, for the causal closure principle, where physical things only affect other physical things, this also shows that even though we mentally perceive ourselves as being the cause of a certain effect, just because we think we are the cause of a certain effect, that doesn't necessarily imply that we are. It might just be the case that Allah has created this qudra, this power within us, this will within us, which makes us believe that we are accountable, and makes us see how we are accountable for the actions. But anyways, that was quite long, but I thought that was interesting to discuss. Next, inshallah, we'll discuss the next attribute of Allah, which is His knowledge. الصفة الثانية العلم. ندعي أن الله تعالى عالم بجميع المعلومات الموجودات والمعدومات. So we claim that Allah the Most High is all-knowing, encompassing all information about the existence and the non-existence. So Allah has knowledge of the mawjudat and the ma'dumat, so those things which exist and those things which do not exist. فإن الموجودات منقسمة إلى قديم وحادث. So he's saying here that those things which existing things, they are divided into eternal and the created. والقديم وذاته وصفاته